All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Austin Smedley. I am a features desk editor here for The Breeze and a writer for The Baseline. And this is episode 2 of Beyond the Well. This is going to be an episode we're going to talk about ancestry and spirituality, just because people just don't talk about these things enough. So I have with me today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paris Barraza. I am the audience engagement director for The Breeze. I'm also a writer for The Baseline, and I'm very excited to be here.
Appreciate it. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
So just to kind of get the conversation started here, ancestry. It's a big point of contention for a lot of people. Some people care about it, some people don't. And it kind of blows me away that some people don't. What's your perspective on ancestry? Do you care about it? Do you find it to be particularly important?
Yeah, I believe it's absolutely important. I think in more recent years of my life, I'm able to appreciate the value of knowing where you come from, knowing your family, knowing the people that came before you, And I think I do agree with the fact that there's a lot of people out there that have no interest in learning more about their lineage and about their loved ones. But like I said, it's definitely something that in recent years I've grown to appreciate.
With age, maybe?
Definitely with age. I think when I was younger, that wasn't something I even really thought about. And I grew up in an environment where it wasn't something it wasn't something that was of importance. And I think after the death of my abuelita, my grandmother, on my mom's side, that was something that I think sparked my mom and myself and some of our family to really start thinking about what's important to us.
That's a good way to put it. One of the ways that I tend to describe ancestry, or the importance that I give it to people who maybe don't or just are interested, I usually put it this way. You're not just you.
Mm-hmm.
There's thousands upon thousands of years of evolution, of memories, of feelings, of war, political strife, what have you, within your veins, alive right now. A lot of people are very based in the self, and a lot of people don't think twice about, well, I'm me, I'm unique, I'm me.
Mm-hmm.
When at the end of the day, you aren't you. You're not just you. Of course, you are you in the sense that you have your own thoughts, opinions, and stuff like that. But it goes so much deeper than that. The DNA and the genetics that make you up are not the result of you bringing yourself into existence. This goes a lot deeper than that.
Absolutely.
So that being said, where are you and your family? Like, do you know where they're from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, recently the whole trend of, getting different DNA kits and 23andMe, that definitely came about, and we were definitely susceptible to that, but in the best way possible. My mom and my dad both did it. On my mom's side, she's from Costa Rica, so I'm half Costa Rican. On my dad's side, he's Mexican, grandparents from Mexico, so on and so forth. Doing those tests, there was a lot of European lineage, which is not surprising, and small percentages of indigenous peoples in Mexico and in Costa Rica. So that was definitely interesting. I do agree with you, though, about the whole point is we are definitely a culmination of everyone that's come before us. And I think it's sort of arrogant to think otherwise.
Europeans it's pretty well established, the whole colonialism, especially with the Aztec and Mayan peoples, a lot of the Spanish, a lot of people from that region of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And more so, even this is the same case for the United States too, and all over the world, really. We're all mixed up. So, you said half of your family's from Mexico. Are they superstitious at all? Do they hold any of those traditions to be high in regard? Do they still practice them to this day?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I love where you're going with it because, of course, I think most people who, identify themselves as Mexican would probably have somebody in their family that they would definitely point to as being superstitious, and goes the same in my family. My grandparents are Catholic and are pretty devout. But that being said, there's definitely this whole idea of, witches, brujas, and, having to be careful about anything related to the occult and supernatural, and very superstitious in the sense that there's little things that they would practice. When we'd enter somebody's home, there were little things that I don't really remember, but my grandmother would do because, there was a proper way of entering the home and things like that it was just fears on their part. So definitely. And the same on my mom's side from Costa Rica. There's also different practices that they would do that again was just warding off any evil. And then of course always the classic, blessing the house, sage, rosemary bush in front. We still have a rosemary bush in front of my house. So all those, I think, really common things, we always did. Yeah.
That's hilarious. Like I physically and, mostly genetically, I'm a white guy too.
Sure.
But I grew up in a Salvadorian family, so I completely understand the whole, like I was telling you earlier, my grandmother, who is Salvadorian, as superstitious as you can possibly get.
Yeah.
Setting up statues, turning them facing you when you come in and facing away from you. These little things like that. Yeah. They're extremely superstitious, but she's a very devout Christian.
Yeah.
She was a Catholic for a long time too. And one of the particular figures of interest for me in that, and just a lot of Hispanic and Chicano lineage, one of the folklore heroes, or I can say heroes, but one of the characters is La Santa Muerte. And I think I knew who she was, but I first became aware of her through that Salvadorian grandmother who was frightened at the very sight of the shirt that I was wearing, because that's what it was on. Like, hi, Santa Muerte. Who?
Yeah, immediately worried about your soul.
Exactly. So, and of course, that's tied to my lineage. Like my grandfather was a Hispanic. He was from and born in Mexico, and it's only now that he died before I was born. But I want to get to know him, and I get to know him, and I get to understand him by learning about the culture that he came from. Maybe not the spiritual practices that he took part in, but by understanding him and by understanding where he came from, I have a better understanding of myself. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I know that, like I was mentioning earlier, with the death of my abuelita, who in our family was always very sensitive to spirits. She saw, always said that she'd seen different things throughout her life. And, we had all the reason to believe that. So I think with that, it definitely encouraged myself to really want to get to know her, because at the end of the day, I never really got to know her. She was already older, and when she had passed, she was sick. And I think that, I attribute to her somebody who gave so much to my life that I don't really know about. She represents a whole side of family that I really don't know much about, and it's something that I definitely want to explore. So I definitely agree that there's people in our family and who have passed and have been long gone that really represent so much about us that we don't really know yet. It's important to discover that.
I think so too. Especially you kind of referenced the 23andMe and Ancestry explosion over the past couple years. And I think it's interesting. I actually did a poll on Instagram once, and I wanted to see who cared and who didn't. Is your ancestry important to you? It was kind of split halfway down the middle for the most part, but it was a little more towards the I care side of it. But just like many polls, you can't really get an idea of how much they care or in what ways they care. Like the whole 23andMe, they have a lot of testing, and they can show you some health risks and stuff that you have. So some people are interested in it because of that. Some are interested in it because they want to find more about their lineage, like, oh, am I related to so-and-so?
Right.
Like Abraham Lincoln or something like that. When it comes to big figures, I'm sure that all of us related to someone at some point in time.
Sure. And, I'm a little bit cynical because, we did partake in all those tests, and it's interesting. And I think we had sort of intentions that we just genuinely wanted to know more about where we come from. But I'm a little bit cynical, and I feel like a lot of people that, got those tests were thinking like, oh, I'm going to lay claim to, some certain heritage or some certain, group of people to better me in life,
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm actually Native American, you guys. Surprise. And
I'm not interesting, but they
are. Yeah, just kind of taking advantage of that. But I like that. I mean, I'd like to think that people are doing it because they're interested in history, because it's so rich.
It is very rich, and like the old adage goes, like in order to avoid repeating history, you have to understand it. Yeah. And I like to take that and flip it around on its head and say, well, rather than avoiding repeating history, you can take a perspective on history and look at the ways that your ancestors lived and the practices that they dove into, and you can better understand it yourself. You understand their history, you now understand yourself a little bit more, and their predispositions that you have. This kind of comes and wraps around to the whole concept of metagenetics, which Stephen McNallen, he's an author that I really appreciate, wrote a lot about European native spirituality called Ancestry, which is basically like a revival of the worship and study of Odin, Thor, and all that.
Interesting, yeah.
Metagenetics, as he defined it, was just how some of us are more we have a predisposition to certain illnesses because of our genetics. We are athletic or not athletic. That's a lineage thing. You can see that. And there are variations, but for the most part, you can see it. It's genetic. who's to say that that same, carry on, that same passing of the torch, so to speak, doesn't involve spirituality either? Like, it's one of the main arguments of his why native Europeans or people who are from Norway, Sweden, Germany, the Germanic areas of Europe, should return to their ancestral roots because there's a spiritual power there.
Mm-hmm.
And if you unlock that spiritual power, you start understanding yourself more, understanding your ancestors more, and things become a little bit more clear. And it's always nature-centric. Do you think that's valid at all?
I do. I mean, the first thing that kind of popped into my head, and, excuse me, because I'm definitely not as knowledgeable about this as I should be, but I'm bringing it up, is that, that was the whole issue for, the Jewish people after World War II, is that, well, for ongoing, they never had a place to call their own. And, they were continually exiled throughout, history. And so that's sort of the issue with not having, a place where you can go back to and find your roots. And there's power in that. I understand that point, that there's power in returning back to somewhere that you and people, like you, who carry the same beliefs, who so on and so forth. So I do think that there's power in that. But it's interesting because I don't really have a connection with that myself, but I can see why, people would have an interest in that.
Yeah, the spiritual practices of your ancestors, a lot of people kind of forget this because we live in a society that has been so Christianized, especially the United States over the past 2,000, give or take, or so years. It's become such a it's just a reality of life for us. We view the concept of God often through Abrahamic faith, the lens of the Abrahamic faiths. And it's kind of the standardized way of looking at things, the same way our elementary schools and our high schools were standardized. It's just the standardized way we often look at religion. It's difficult to really picture a world in which that wasn't the case, though, in which nature was the center, in which our cultural roots were the center, because that really isn't the case. Christianity blended with a lot of the native people and kind of each tribe made it its own, but it's kind of a perversion of their culture and it's a perversion of their cultural roots. Hence why many in Mexico and Spain, I think a lot of them are very Catholic, the Roman Catholics and stuff like that.
Right.
It's a bastardization of their culture. Do you think returning to the older roots, the older ways, the ways prior to the Roman Catholics, their invasion and stuff like that, do you think that should be seen? Or
that's an interesting question. I think maybe because I'm more rooted in this idea that what can we do, if that's really even plausible or possible, I think is the better word for that. So I would almost imagine that you have to take it from a modern perspective and say, as an individual, what can I do to sort of have a better understanding of everything that's influenced me? And I think that's a very large, and that's a large journey. And that's a large process to do so, but I'm saying that just because I'm not convinced that at this point in time, there's any other way to go about it. And that's maybe a little bit more narrow-minded, but I think in terms of being able to go back to your roots, I think at this point it's just more of an individual taking, and you can't expect an entire group to go back with you to your homeland. That's a cheap way of saying it, but that's sort of my idea or my take on it.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't value it as much as others do, and there are groups that are very, very dedicated to wanting to go back. I mean, there's a debate, especially now, that colonialism, and it's a big topic of conversation. And I'm kind of the mind that I do agree that this was not my ancestors' homeland, and I dream of having the ability and the funds and the financial stability to one day return to my homeland, because I want to be there.
Sure.
The sun's too hot here, man. It hurts. It hurts.
That's fair, and I do get why people would want to. Because like I said, there is something very powerful about going back to that history and where you originated from, or if you have family that originated from a certain area, wanting to go back and put your roots there, because there's probably a lot to learn from just being there.
Yeah, and you're surrounded by an environment that was literally home, and not just home in that, I built a house here, but no, home in that my entire lineage was born and raised from the plants that grew from this soil. They toiled it. They fought wars here. granted for more practical reasons than, they're not holy wars and anything like that. But
Right.
I think there is definitely a lot of power in that, not just, well, it's spiritual power, definitely. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Like we were talking about La Santa Muerte earlier, and my journey, trying to understand my own lineage, my Hispanic lineage, through learning about her. I think it's important. Like you mentioned, you celebrate Dia de los Muertos.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it is. It's an opportunity that I feel in my current, time in the life that I'm living right now. It feels like, one of those few opportunities that I can take and use in order to, honor all the loved ones, who've recently passed away, but people that, I only knew their names, and it's an opportunity for my family to get together and just celebrate them and have a conversation about who they were and, what they did for us. You start to learn so much more. And, so we made the ofrenda, which is, an offering, and, we put out all the different items that we knew that they would like. And the whole purpose is to put out an energy in hopes that, they will reciprocate it, because the idea is that, they're still with us. And so going back to how I felt about it was an opportunity for me to really, connect with them in a way that I don't think I was able to prior.
Yeah, like what we were talking about earlier, death being not a finite end, not a finite stamp. Okay, person's dead, move on. It's a curtain. I referenced Steve McNallen again here because I think he put it in a very eloquent way. When I think about death, I think about it in two different ways. One's like it's like the death is the greatest equalizer, in that we will not find equality amongst ourselves, but death.
Yes, yeah.
In death, we're all equal, king, peasant, what have you. And then there's the other side of the coin that also says, yes, it's an equalizer. However, it's not the end. It's a curtain. And like we were saying earlier, within a lot of ancient tribes all over Europe and all over Mexico prior to the Christianization of it and the impersonal nature of that belief system, the dead were not just buried and forgotten about. They were buried within within their city's walls, and that they were buried there, and they were considered as being part of the community still.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just okay, they're done, whatever. You don't matter anymore. That could not possibly be less true. They do matter. They are still a central part of the community. They still lived, fought, and bled for this land the same way that we're doing so now. How are they any more or less valid just because they're living a different life than us now?
Right. Yeah, and it ties back into this idea of valuing wisdom and valuing what they did for your community, your family, whatever it may be. So the way I like to frame it is, I don't know if you've read Kurt Vonnegut, but Slaughterhouse-Five, it's not at all about death, but I do think it's somewhat of a good metaphor likened to the whole curtain analogy, in the sense that in the book, there's all these different dimensions, and humans, we can only see a couple of them. So, for example, our arms and legs exist in this dimension, but we have other limbs protruding in different dimensions that we just don't see and we're not aware about. Obviously, I'm not saying we have different limbs and different dimensions.
Say
That's
what you really
crazy.
mean.
But I do think that there's this idea of all these different dimensions that are layered, and that's how we connect with, our ancestors and people who have passed, is that, it's not that they're necessarily going to a heaven or a hell that's, in such a large, distance, but that they're right next to us in these different dimensions that we can't see, that are not tangible to us. And so I do think all these different tribes sort of recognize something like that and realize how important it is to continue and maintain a connection with them, know?
Yeah, and it's sort of that, like I mentioned earlier, with the ancestors being a part of the community still. In the modern day, when people get old, send them to a nursery home, send them here, send them there. Yeah. I don't want them living with me. They're not my problem. That's a pretty common attitude. It's not the case with everyone, but it's a pretty common attitude. And it's a shame, because as opposed to the days in which the ancestors and our dead, even our old, were considered as part of the community as everybody else was, now they're God's problem.
Right.
Now they're the nursery home's problem, rather than, no, they're still a part of us. You were you, grandpa, grandma, you are a part of me.
Absolutely.
And I'm a part of you. I'm a continuation of you. Our bloodline is going to continue. You matter to me. You don't matter any more or less to me just because you're old or you're old or what have you. It's a weird way of viewing it. You know?
It is. Yeah, I definitely would argue it's an American culture, because I do believe that most minorities, tend to, bring in their elderly back in their homes and take the time to care for them. But it's about valuing them and recognizing that they have so much to continue sharing and giving, to the family, to, again, your community, whatever it may be. But recognizing that they have a role, So it's frustrating because when you realize, all the history that they have, all the wisdom, everything that they might be able to share with you, and so many people throw that away.
Mm-hmm.
And exactly, they put them into convalescent homes, visit them twice a year, and then have a funeral. And that's the end of that. And it's, I think, a very, very, I don't know, for lack of better words, just a sad way of treating somebody. Yeah.
The elders that I have are extremely important to me. Like my grandfather on my father's side, and also I'll extend it to my Salvadoran family. Reference them again. My grandmother on that side, she's starting to get up there. I think she's actually in her 70s now.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire family, all 5 of the sisters, they all come together and they make sure she's taken care of.
Yeah.
Like from the moment that they were 15, 16 years old and they actually started getting jobs, they were giving her money. Even when they didn't live with her anymore, like it's still a common thing for them.
Right.
They give them money. I think that's such an important thing. I mean, they make sure that they're taken care of regardless. And that's a value and a cultural tradition that should be upheld amongst everyone.
Yes, absolutely.
It should be upheld amongst everyone. You shouldn't have to be from this culture or that culture, because if you go back far enough, you'll find that the ancestors and the dead were a part of the community forever. And not just once they die, now you're done. Like, no, old age, dead, young, middle-aged, they were all part of the community in the same way. And kind of just to kind of match that up a little bit, in terms of how we view old age now, it's strange. It's like when we look at old people, you hear the term ageism or whatever it is, like ageism. Like, it's almost like a discrimination against older people because they happen to be older than you. Not only do I find that ludicrous because they are so much more wise than me and I want to learn from them, and they can give you the best conversation sometimes, but
they'll always be interesting.
Yeah, they'll always be interesting. And it's interesting how we kind of discriminate against them now that they're older, and we kind of view them in a different way than we view ourselves. You really have to sit down and take a look at this grandfather or grandmother of yours and say, like, they were just like me at one point or another.
Right.
In a younger body, able to move and all that. They weren't always what they are now. And there's a lot that you can learn from them and a lot that you should take the time to learn from them, because you'd be surprised.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a separate topic, but I think in our elderly, they're kind of likened to being children, and so they get taken advantage of, and, you always hear horror stories about that. But I do know that for myself, my abuelito, he's 91, and I've probably learned more about my family from him than anyone else, and there's a reason for that. It's because he, out of everyone in my family, would know the most, and that just comes with age.
Yeah, and I'll end with a quote from Justin Garcia here. More of a paraphrase, but I heard him. He owns a couple martial arts gyms and academies, and he once said, he was talking to the host of a show he was on. He said, we all care about our ancestors and our the elderly and stuff like that. We care about the alive ones. It shouldn't end there, though.
Mm-hmm.
We should care about every ancestor that we've ever had, because they are a part of us. We should take the time to get to know them, and again, get to better understand ourselves. So I'd like to take the time to thank you for coming on. I appreciate this. This is good conversation. Again, this has been episode 2, Beyond the Well. We talked about ancestry and spirituality and the connection that they have there, because these things just don't get talked about enough. I'm your host, Austin Smedley. You can find me on Instagram under Austin X Smedley, because the nameless face that took the full name, I don't want the X to be there. I'm going to complain about this until the solution gets resolved. So Austin X Smedley on Instagram and Austin Smedley 1 on Twitter. So
thank you very much for having me.
Would you like to do any plugins? Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you can go ahead. You can go ahead and find me on Twitter or Instagram, Paris Barraza.